Over the past several days, 3 females have been found dead.
Looks like someone's going after these girls.
Then they have to know to watch their backs.
Streaming March 13th.
You really want what happened to this woman that happened to you?
Exactly why I need to keep going on this.
Starring Emmy Award winner Amanda Seyfried.
I'm worried about what you're gonna find.
So am I.
Long Bright River. A limited series. Streaming March 13th. Only on Peacock.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
If I must choose between God and the King, I choose God. St. Anselm of Canterbury, 1095. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history. Specifically on this episode, the 9th part of a larger tale of how 3 brothers dealt with the death of their legendary father. This isn't a polished story with neatly placed heroes and villains, but rather a complicated story of 3 young men cast haphazardly upon the peaks of European power. A massive vacuum was left when their father, William the Conqueror, passed away, and his 3 boys were left picking up the pieces. This miniseries that I'm calling A Tale of 3 Brothers is a story of sibling rivalry, betrayal, power, ambition, broken alliances, massive political restructuring, and each man's quest for legitimacy and legacy on a channel-spanning scale that includes kingdoms, duchies, and even the Holy Land itself. This is the 9th, and sadly final, part of this miniseries, and this one's separated into 3 sections. First, there's an incident between an old bloodline and a powerful earl that Archbishop Anselm must attend to. Second, Anselm finds himself in some serious hot water with his own king. And finally, as if they were feeling left out in recent years, Northumbria decides to make some noise. They're pretty good at that. Now, before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording, for as low as just $1 a month. So please join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. Also, an extra quick note about our Fortune's Wheel YouTube page. Yeah, we have one of those. Actually, we've had it for a few years, but man, YouTube, that's a whole thing. And I've finally set it up. Backfilled all our episodes, even organized them into playlists. Pretty cool stuff, in my opinion. So if you're interested, head over to YouTube and show some support there. And even if you don't use it to listen to the show, a simple 30 seconds to like and subscribe, it really does go a very long way for podcasts like this one. So looking forward to seeing some of you over there. Now this is episode 154, entitled Fingers in the Dam. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. We won't spend much time on this little story that occurred during William Rufus's reign. It's interesting, and I find it quite telling in understanding not only the dynamics of English royalty and nobility during the 1090s, but it also gives us a little glimpse into the type of man Anselm was. See, there were still a couple ladies on the island who held some pretty dangerous genetics. And they were both, curiously enough, at a nunnery at the prestigious Wilton Abbey. From there, the similarities end. One was in her early 30s and the other was only 12. and their bloodlines were not exactly friendly, though I can't imagine them specifically not getting along, but who knows for sure. I digress. The older lady's name was Gunnhilde, the younger one, Edith. Now, Gunnhilde was the youngest daughter of King Harold II Godwinson. Edith was the daughter of King Malcolm III Canmore of Scotland. We will have plenty of time to talk about young Edith soon enough, so we'll focus on Gunnhilde here. In 1093, Gunnhilde had yet to take the vows to become a nun, though she had been at the convent for a couple decades already. William Rufus was most likely aware of this, but it never seemed to bother him. She was, without question, a threat to his position, but, she was a nobody in a nunnery at this point. What fear should he have? But when Anselm arrived, he noticed right away Gunnhilde's place in this whole story, and he thought it best to press the king into either proactively seeking a marriage or pushing her to take her vows. Or, well, I suppose there are fates worse than marriage. Rufus, though, didn't take the matter too seriously, but as Archbishop, Anselm did. One of the roles of Archbishop, especially the leading one in a kingdom, was to keep safe the status quo, though I doubt they would dare put that in the job description. Now, suddenly, without warning, in late 1093, Alan the Red, also called Alan Rufus, the Breton nobleman and powerful earl in England by this time, well, Alan Rufus had ridden to Wilton Abbey and left Wilton Abbey with Gunnhilde. Now, we're not talking Swain Godwinson here, right? If you remember from a long time ago. Now, Alan Rufus didn't steal Gunnhilde. In fact, by so many accounts, it might have been a legit crush, which led to a strong relationship between the two, a love bond even. But think about this for a minute. An extremely wealthy and powerful lord just took it upon himself to marry. Now, it didn't matter who. He took it upon himself to marry. Now, it was customary that the king approved of all marriages, as marriages were alliances. And if a marriage united two powerful houses, then that was without question a possible threat to the crown. The king needed oversight in this. You don't do it. You don't do it without royal permission. And Alan did it. And it was Gunnhilde, no less. So one of the most powerful lords in England just married the last surviving daughter of a former king. That was akin to treason, to be quite honest. But see, because monks did the writing in those days, and monks removed themselves from the persuasions and urges of desire, they didn't take too kindly to most women in those chronicles. Pent-up emotions can yield some fairly dangerous products, I dare say. In the case of the chronicles, those dangerous products came in the form of demonizing the behaviors of women at all strata of society. Now, decades later, William of Malmesbury, one of those monks, you could say, wrote, quote, "She abandoned her purpose of chastity and yielded to worldly desire," end quote. Alan Rufus? Nah, don't worry about him. He's just being a guy, right? But Gunnhilde, she should know better. She was a nun, no less. But here's the thing. Was she? Was she a nun? There's absolutely nothing in the records indicating she took the vows. In fact, in a letter that we're going to get to later from St. Anselm of Canterbury, he actually admits that she never actually took the vows. Without those vows, she would still be available, so to speak, for marriage. For Alan Rufus to ride into town and easily ride out with her, well, this leads me to believe that Gunnhilde may have still been chaste, but she hadn't taken her vows. And being the daughter of King Harold II, she knew the power she held in that moment, within her blood. Whether Rufus took note, we don't really know, but we know for a fact that the Archbishop of Canterbury did. Boy, oh boy, did he take note. He wrote 2 letters, as I said. And as much as I'm enjoying reading about St. Anselm and his own writings, admittedly, these 2 letters are really, really a bad look for him. They are harsh. The first letter Anselm wrote to Gunnhilde came just after word came that she ran away and wed Alan Rufus. He's taking the role of the spiritual shepherd, hoping to lead his lost sheep back to her abbey. He writes, quote, "But since we have no opportunity for talking, necessity forces me to write what I think about you and what I wish for you. I implore you, therefore, not to spurn the love with which I love you for the sake of God, for his honor and for your salvation, and not to reject my advice." End quote. So a little strange, but not too bad, right? Well, it goes south from there, like really, really far south. It's rather subtle at first, but soon it became a torrent. Now, diving right in, Anselm writes the following in that first letter, quote, "Consider now, dearest daughter, how far apart are the embraces of men and the pleasure of the flesh from the embraces of Christ and from the pleasure of chastity and purity of heart. To be sure, I do not call the embraces of Christ physical, but they are such that a soul makes itself his friend through love and desire for him within a good conscience. Consider, I ask you, the difference between these two pleasures." End quote. So establishing that Gunnhilde has effectively shunned the embrace of Christ for the embrace of some guy, Anselm continues, quote, "Ponder what it means to scorn Christ, your spouse, who promises the kingdom of heaven as dowry, and to prefer to the Son of God, the King of Kings, a mortal man, who gives and promises only corruption and contemptible things. Indeed, this King of Kings has desired your beauty as of a lawful spouse. But my sister, how shall I say, in what way? That man, whom you know, grasped at the beauty of your flesh. Noble woman, how shall I say it? You, a virgin, were chosen to be the spouse of God and marked out for him by your habit and way of life. What shall I say you are now? What shall I say you are now?" End quote. Yikes. I mean, he doesn't say it, which might be heavier than actually saying it. But man, it's certainly insinuated, isn't it? But he's pretty adamant. He doubles down, quote, "If I do not speak up, perhaps you may take no notice. If I do speak, perhaps you may be angry. What have you done with the chosen and designated spouse of God? Your nobility may blush to be what you blush to hear. And I, because of your nobility and my affection for you, blush to say it." End quote. He says she's committed a quote-unquote grave and serious fall. Now after this, after bringing her right up to the line of saying the insult out loud, putting it in writing for all posterity, he gently appeals for her to rejoin the abbey, which I don't know about you, but you attract a lot more bees with nectar than with vinegar. You can't slap someone and then kiss them, expect things to be okay. It doesn't really work that way. He implores her to, quote, "throw off and trample on the secular dress you have assumed, and put on again the habit of the spouse of Christ, which you have cast off." End quote. I mean, had he not said what he'd already said, I'd venture to say this was an earnest and genuine appeal for her soul. The rest of his first letter to Gunnhilde shows Anselm in a fairly decent light. The guy was genuinely concerned for her well-being, spiritually, of course, in the rest of the letter. But that beginning is rough. I really don't know what to say about it. Well, you and I know the political implications of what she'd done, so it's never that simple. After a year or so, Gunnhilde still hadn't left Alan Rufus. In fact, they were going strong as a newlywed couple. If she born Alan Rufus a son, then the repercussions of it would reverberate across the kingdom in shocking fashion. Whether Alan or Gunnhilde ever acted upon it, it would whisper an alternative in the ears of the English and their barons. The mere existence of this child would shake the foundations that were just now beginning to cure. And suddenly, Alan died. No details. He was older, but there was absolutely no reason given in the records. Curious, isn't it? And yet, Gunnhilde still failed to return to Wilton Abbey. In fact, Gunnhilde remained in her home, which was inherited by Alan Rufus's little brother, Alan Niger, or Alan the Black. Now, no one knows what kind of relationship these two people had, but Anselm didn't take any chances. He wrote another letter to Gunnhilde. He begins with the typical introductions, but launches into his dismay at her decisions not to return to Wilton, saying that God chose her from birth to become his spouse one day, quote, who loved you so much through no previous merits of your own, end quote. Okay, slight dig there. It gets better, though. Check this out. Regarding her staying with Alan the Black, he writes, quote, consider, what is the glory of the world? What is it that you love? You are the daughter of the king and queen. Where are they? They are worms and dust. Their exalted rank, their pleasures, their riches neither preserved them nor went with them. Your loved one who loved you, Count Alan Rufus, where is he now? Where has that beloved lover of yours gone? Go now, sister, lie down with him on the bed in which he now lies. Gather his worms to your bosom. Embrace his corpse. Press your lips to his naked teeth, for his lips have already been consumed by putrefaction. Certainly he does not now care for your love, in which he delighted while alive, and you shrink from his rotting flesh, which you long to possess. This assuredly is what you loved in him, and this, and nothing else, is what you love in his brother? End quote. That's some pretty rough stuff to say to an orphan and a widow, especially from a man of God. I almost couldn't believe it was true when I read it. But see, Anselm wasn't finished. He was rather livid at the whole situation, and truly, we have no clue what happened to Alan the Red, or Alan Rufus, but a clue might be in what Anselm follows this up with. Check this out. He writes, quote, what if God took Count Alan the Black away from his life, lest he take you away from God as he intended? Skipping a few lines, he continues, quote, why are you not afraid that because of you God may kill Count Alan Niger by a similar death? Or, what is worse, if you are united with him, God may condemn him with you by eternal death. End quote. I don't know. Smoking gun? We'll never know. But it's a terrible look for Anselm, right? And the letter goes on and on and on, trying to get her back to Wilton. In all honesty, this was far, far less about her eternal soul, in my opinion anyway, than it was about protecting the Norman claim to the crown of England. As for Gunnhilde, she and Alan Niger never conceived. In fact, that's about all we know about Gunnhilde. She completely disappears from the records. And with that, we conclude this chapter of William Rufus's reign. And for good measure to you listeners there, I have included the links in the show notes for the first letter from Anselm to Gunnhilde and the second letter from Anselm to Gunnhilde. I urge you all to head over there and check it out for yourself. It's interesting writing, to say the least.
This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
Now, switching gears to a second part of our show here, by 1094, King William Rufus was growing increasingly frustrated with Normandy. He just unloaded literal boatloads of English gold into the duchy to try to foment rebellion against his brother Robert Curthose, but his plans were quickly unraveling. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the D Chronicle specifically states, quote unquote, King William was greatly troubled and crossed the sea to Normandy, where he found nothing but deceit and treachery. What made things worse was William Rufus' increasingly sour demeanor and rising temper. It was getting out of hand. Rufus was increasingly distrustful of his court back in England, lashing out at suspected conspirators, but nothing was firm. For some reason, maybe reasons we will never know, just didn't make it into the records, Rufus caught wind of something and was getting more and more nervous about his station in life. If he could pull Normandy into his fold, then that would be not only another source from which to pull from, should he need to, but it was also a backup plan if things really went sour back in England. The paranoia was real with Rufus by 1094. As for Duke Robert Curthose, as usual, he not only lacked resources, but he also lacked the ability to properly use them, even if he'd had them. And if he wasn't able to handle it when he had it, then there's no question he couldn't handle things when he was without them. Orderic Vitalis once wrote of Curthose, quote, a man of great charm, but little prudence, often generous to a fault, squandering wealth he did not possess, end quote. Control over the duchy wasn't just slipping, it had slipped. Normandy was a dumpster fire by 1094. Compounding it all, Curthose wasn't just feeling the pinch from his barons, he was also feeling the pinch from both of his brothers. Yes, Henry was still in charge of Domfront and was quickly gaining loyalists of his own, inside Normandy and out. Remember how close Domfront was from Maine and Anjou. But Henry, as we've established, was playing the long game here. He knew the barons had shifted away from Curthose, and he knew that Rufus, due to the Treaty of 1093, effectively became the person the buck stopped with there in the duchy. Henry didn't have to do much in this situation. Sitting and waiting was his best play. A contemporary letter from the time described Henry this way, quote, the youngest son of the conqueror is ever calculating, watching, and listening, end quote. Watching both Rufus and Curthose exhaust themselves, fighting for control of Normandy, both fighting for each other and against each other, it might have actually been quite entertaining to hear the news if I was Henry. By late 1094, Henry was entering into negotiations with larger and larger barons across the duchy, though at the time, this was done in secret. Now, by the winter of 1094, Rufus realized the situation in the duchy was approaching dangerous levels of rebellion, and he was quickly running through his resources and manpower. He returned to England that winter. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle had this to say, quote unquote, the king demanded ever more tribute, and the land groaned under his demands. It's almost comical how the elites throughout history never seem to understand that taxation is not really the best way to your people's hearts. I don't know, just me? And it wasn't just the nobility and the peasantry. Church leaders also groaned. I like that word that the Chronicles used, because that really does encapsulate what they were thinking. Church leaders also groaned under the weight of this new taxation, and England's clergy began to reach out to the archbishops to intervene on the behalf of, well, everyone. This had blown right past taxation. This was firmly extortion. The money wasn't even being used in England. The English, by and large, couldn't care less about what happened in Normandy. Rufus was stealing people's money in England and resources there in England, and he was using them not in England. Not cool, right? Anselm in particular took notice of this, and Anselm said something to the king. And the king, he didn't much care for his archbishop's lip. And the king called a council in early 1095 to deal with this arrogant churchman. Known today as the Council of Rockingham, all the king's horses and all the king's men, as well as all the king's clergy, congregated in Rockingham, which is just a rock's throw southeast from Leicester in March. It was time Rufus dealt with the boldness of this new archbishop. The tensions between Rufus and Anselm had come to a boiling point. Didn't take long. But it's not about the way Anselm talks to noblewomen, and it's not about the recent taxation. Not necessarily, anyway. It's about something we haven't much reason to mention on the show so far, but it was a very real conversation, constant conversation, occurring from the moment Anselm was forced to take the role of Archbishop. Who had the authority to determine religious allegiance in England? The king or the pope? Now, since Rufus had ascended the throne, he had exercised tight control over the English church, keeping bishoprics vacant to collect their revenues and resisting outside interference, particularly from Rome. However, as we know, a dying Rufus decided to fill his most lucrative position, that of Canterbury. Enter Anselm. Now, Anselm was a staunch Gregorian, thus he, in 1093, was a staunch supporter of the current pope, Pope Urban II. His father, the Conqueror, well, he never formally recognized Pope Gregory VII's successors, and Rufus just continued the family tradition. Rome had seen, after the death of Gregory VII, a pope already come and go, and now, in 1095, Rufus had yet to formally recognize the current pope. The investiture controversy, remember that? Well, it was still burning bright all over Europe. And if you hadn't noticed, Rufus loved to do as he pleased, especially when it came to the church. I mean, he didn't just invest the Archbishopric of Canterbury to Anselm. He did so violently, broke the guy's finger. And he had stayed neutral between Urban II and his rival, Antipope Clement III, using the situation to manipulate concessions from Rome. Rufus didn't care about the Pope, but he loved the privileges Rome gave him, trying to cozy up and gain the support of another kingdom. Now, recently, in 1094, Anselm had asked the king to allow him, it was customary, to travel to Rome to receive his pallium, which would recognize Anselm as the Archbishop of Canterbury officially. Instead of just saying no, Rufus furiously exploded at Anselm, declaring that no church official in England could acknowledge any pope without his explicit permission. Returning to the heart of the matter, who had the authority to determine religious allegiance in England? The king or the pope? To put it another way, was Anselm not happy with the approval of his king? Why did Anselm feel he needed to go to Rome? Was the Pope a higher power than the King of England? To state the obvious, yeah, Anselm did actually think that the Pope was a higher authority than King William II of England. That's a no-brainer. Regardless of where you fall on this issue, you can see why Rufus would be furious, though. This hadn't gone away either. Anselm poked and prodded and never let it go. He never took Rufus's emphatic no as final. By early 1095, the dispute had escalated to the point where Rufus called a grand assembly. This, as you can imagine, is, I just said, the Council of Rockingham in March of 1095. He would publicly force Anselm to submit to the king and give up this charade about going to Rome for some pallium. Anyone who was anyone in the kingdom was there for this. I mean, come on. Who would really want to miss this slugfest? Bishops and abbots and archbishops, royal justiciars and barons and earls, representatives of the king's household and court, business magnates even. I mean, this council was a biggie for sure. Rufus from the outset expected the clergy to side with him and condemn Anselm. Edmer, Anselm's friend and biographer and eyewitness to this council, wrote the following, quote, "The king's bishops, dreading his fierce and implacable anger, dared not speak a word in Anselm's favor." End quote. The king's accusation boiled down to this. Anselm had sworn fealty to him and was thus bound to obey him in all things, including religious matters. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury first. Canterbury is a part of England first. As far as Rufus was concerned, by asking for permission to retrieve his pallium from the Pope way off in Rome, Anselm had officially recognized that Pope. By his very position as Archbishop of Canterbury, he was a representative of England itself. As a representative of the Kingdom of England, he was by definition subservient to its king. But wait, Rufus reasoned, how could someone subservient to a king legally usurp the prerogatives of said king? By asking for the pallium, Anselm, on behalf of England, Rufus argued anyway, bypassed the king and went against the royal stance on who or who was not pope. This was actually a pretty serious and legit accusation. As far as the legal aspects of this, I'm no medieval legal expert by far, but it seems like a pretty solid case against Anselm. The king's justiciars demanded that Anselm renounce Urban and submit entirely to royal authority. But you can imagine, Anselm, standing alone, flatly refused. Edmer quotes Anselm here, quote, "I am the servant of St. Peter, and I will not renounce my obedience to his rightful successor. To do so would be to betray my soul and my office," end quote. Folks, the investiture controversy officially reached England's shores. To be sure, it's no secret that Norman rulers thumbed their nose up at Rome, generally speaking, and it's no secret that investiture has long been an issue in the kingdom. No one pretends otherwise. England, the church was a little backwards in many ways at the time. But to be so publicly displayed for all to see, this is what I mean when I say the investiture controversy officially reached English shores. The light was cast upon England's ugly open secret, and now attention could be paid to it. It took Anselm to simply ask his king for a pallium from Rome. Now back to Anselm's declaration. Well, the assembly was in shock after Anselm was finished. Stunned by Anselm's blatant defiance, the king's advisors scrambled for their next move. Really? No plan B if Anselm refused Rufus? You didn't see that one coming? Really? For 2 days, the council was at a standstill, deadlocked. If the barons pressed the issue on either side, they risked their political standing to the king or their spiritual standing with the archbishop. And by the way, their silence also did the same. Quite a catch-22 there for the barons and the archbishops and whatnot. Now, England, again, was groaning, to use the word, from the recent tax hikes. Further instability was to be avoided by these barons at all cost. As for the bishops, many of whom privately sympathized with Anselm, hesitated to take either side openly. Edmer even tells us that the bishops visited Anselm privately, imploring him to yield to the king's demands. Edmer writes, quote, "Why resist the king? Why risk your life for the cause of one who sits across the sea? Submit, and all will be well," end quote. Anselm's characteristic stoic stubbornness kicked in even more in that moment, and he calmly refused his own bishops. Still deadlocked, Rufus calls the council and throws his hands up in contempt for his archbishop. Nothing was accomplished from the Council of Rockingham in 1095. Nothing was solved. The ball hadn't moved an inch during the entire proceeding. Now, curiously, Anselm must have been on a letter-writing campaign in this time, because soon after the Council of Rockingham convened and all went back to their own respected corners, envoys from Pope Urban II in Rome, they arrived in England. They arrived in England bearing the pallium for Anselm. So who really won at Rockingham? Well, this proved that neither Rufus nor Anselm. It was actually the Pope who was currently sitting in Rome, Pope Urban II. Rufus was outraged, but what could he do? Grudgingly, Rufus allowed the pallium to stay, but he ordered that Anselm could not physically take the pallium from the papal delegation. Not physically. The envoys from Rome were ordered to lay the pallium upon Canterbury's altar. Anselm could take it at that point. Symbolically, It was Rufus's way of denying Anselm receiving it directly from Rome. It was symbolically Rufus's way of saying, I am ultimately still in charge here, and I have allowed this to happen. This battle between church and state would continue. This was not the last we'll hear about it either. The Council of Rockingham in 1095 marked the first major ecclesiastical challenge to Rufus's authority, foreshadowing the larger struggles between English monarchy and the church in the centuries to come. Those who know their history might get a shiver up their spine thinking of what will happen in less than 100 years, but I don't want to jump too soon to that.
Pepsid Complete knows that food is one of the best parts of game day. That is, until heartburn strikes. Thankfully, just one chewable tablet of Pepsid Complete provides dual-action heartburn relief with an antacid that starts working instantly and an acid reducer that lasts all day. So you can stay focused on that second helping of chili without worrying about heartburn. All day based on 8-hour symptom relief studies during the day. Use product only as directed.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast here to tell you about Michelob Ultra Courtside. It's getting fans closer to the NBA with a chance to win prizes like courtside seats, a trip to All-Star Weekend, and much more. Check it out at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access, Courtside 24-25 sweepstakes, no purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 and up. Begins on October 1st, 2024, ends July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Shortly after the delivery of the pallium in mid-spring of 1095, word came from up north that rebellion had broken out. First as Archbishop, and now another rebellion up north. Rufus couldn't wrap his head around things at the moment. I mean, how did everything unravel so quickly? He was still desperate to get back down to Normandy, where his pain-in-the-neck brother was losing his duchy to a growing number of barons, including his other pain-in-the-neck brother. Such a mess. Now, this time cut a bit deeper than another Scottish invasion, though. This rebellion was led by one of his own earls, Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumbria. De Mowbray was a powerful magnate with extensive lands in his earldom, inherited after his uncle, Geoffrey de Mowbray, died. However, he had grown quite resentful of Rufus's heavy-handed rule, as well as Rufus's particularly relentless financial demands. Malmesbury describes the crux of de Mowbray's issues with King William II. Quote, "The king drained his nobles dry with unceasing levies, caring not for their ancient rights, but only for his own coffers. De Mowbray, unable to endure further indignities, sought to resist." End quote. And if there's anywhere in England that truly embraced this idea of ancient rights, one could safely say it was Northumbria. Now, the immediate cause of the rebellion was a piratical raid on Norwegian merchants docked at Bristol. De Mowbray and his allies attacked the traders, looting their goods and slaying many of them. This blatant defiance of royal law provided Rufus with a justification to demand de Mowbray's presence at court. And de Mowbray denied the king. I think Rufus is getting sick of people around his kingdom denying him. Essentially, his simple response of no was tantamount to open rebellion. The D Chronicle of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles shows us Rufus's reaction, which always fun, isn't it, to get his reactions on things. Quote, "The king summoned Mowbray to answer for his deeds, but the earl refused, fortifying his castles and raising arms. So the king, in wrath, called forth his host to bring him to justice." End quote. But de Mowbray wasn't alone. He had friends this time. A powerful Norman landowner we've mentioned before in the show, a man who supported William Rufus in Normandy, Count William of Eu, rode with de Mowbray in his rebellion. A powerful Norman lord, Roger de Lacy, was also there. And there was a powerful Northumbrian baron named Edwulf Rus, just really liked to attack the Norman royalty, so it's almost like this Edwulf Rus was like a hockey player, just skating around without gloves or a stick or even a helmet, like just looking for a fight. He didn't care who, but if there was a Norman to fight, Eadwulf Rus would be happy to engage. De Mowbray didn't just intend on rebelling to make a point or even to overthrow the king. He wanted to carve out a nice little Northumbrian kingdom of his own, free from the greedy, grasping hands of William Rufus. However, de Mowbray severely underestimated the mood that William Rufus was in the spring of 1095. Now, catching de Mowbray off guard with a massive royal army, Rufus was seeing red as he invaded Northumbria. Orderic Vitalis describes Rufus's wrath like this, quote, "The king, unrelenting in vengeance, thundered northward, his host grim and terrible to behold. Castles that had defied him fell, their garrisons given no quarter." End quote. Upon the king's approach, de Mowbray fell back to Bamborough Castle, one of the strongest fortresses on the whole island, had been for over a century. The castle, perched on an outcrop of basalt rock, was nearly impregnable. Realizing a direct assault wasn't in the cards, in fact, it was outright foolishness, Rufus adopted a strategy of encirclement and attrition. He built a siege fort to blockade the castle, and Rufus named this siege fort Malvoisin, translated as evil neighbor. So cool. Now, Malmesbury writes, quote, "Seeing that Bamborough would not fall by assault, the king resolved to starve the rebels into submission. Malvoisin was raised, a grim sentinel before the gates of the traitor's lair." End quote. The siege dragged on, though, but Rufus, again, was in kind of a hurry to get back to Normandy. Rockingham and this rebellion had already forced him to wait several months as it was. As fortune would have it, word came that de Mowbray had slipped out of the castle recently and was scouring the earldom for recruits. William sent a detachment to hunt down de Mowbray. Now, near Tynemouth, de Mowbray was noticed and was immediately forced into a battle. The fight was short and it was brutal. Orderic Vitalis describes a scene like this, quote, "He fought fiercely but in vain, his men falling around him. At last, weary and wounded, he was taken in chains, his defiance extinguished." End quote. The rebel leader was dragged before King William back in Malvoisin, and the only judgment he cast was to be imprisoned at Windsor Castle down south. Once they arrived back south, Rufus called for de Mowbray to be brought to him again. Despite his increasing volatile temper, Rufus was merciful with the former earl. It was actually incredibly smart, as it would only ignite more hatred in the north if he wasn't, which is something no king of England at any point in history was happy to witness, an angry Northumbria. Instead, de Mowbray was stripped of all titles and lands and wealth and spent the rest of his life in prison. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, quote, "And so the king was victorious and the rebels were scattered. Those who rose against him found their strength broken and peace was restored." End quote. But the rebellion, coupled with the Council of Rockingham, also brought to the fore some serious cracks in the seemingly prosperous facade of English prosperity under King William II. And Rufus was being shown to be quite the tyrant as of late. Between the harsh taxation, the English deaths across the Channel in Normandy, and his heavy-handed approach with the church, the English were quickly becoming disillusioned with the so far so good reign of Rufus. And all King William could do was to continue to put fingers in the cracking dam of his reign. And as 1095 was nearing its end, as Rufus gathered himself and his resources and made plans to return to Normandy in the spring, an unexpected rumor reached England that Pope Urban II himself was traveling throughout France, and he was preaching a message of war. In late autumn, the first accounts of Urban's speeches reached the ears of both Duke Robert and King William. A Norman chronicler, Baldric of Dol, writes the following, quote, "The Holy Father calls upon the knights of Christendom to take up the cross and liberate the land of our Lord." End quote. No one yet realized the full implications of this strange new call to arms from the Pope. But Duke Robert, ever eager for a new challenge, a new adventure, ever eager for a money-making opportunity, and ever eager to get the spotlight off of him as the duchy was floundering in flames, well, Duke Robert, he was pretty intrigued by this. As 1095 ended, England and Normandy remained in turmoil. Rufus fought on multiple fronts that popped up again and again. Curthose stumbled from one crisis to the next. And little Henry Beauclerc continued to wait comfortably down in Domfront. And now, an event greater than all their rivalries and their rebellions and their intrigues unfolded throughout France, England, Wales, or Scotland was about to commence. The First Crusade. Until next time.